Well, the book consists of 10 biographical chapters about really the most senior key decision makers, both political and military, on the British side. The idea is to enable the reader to see the war through British eyes. It makes the war much more comprehensible because the British often were taking the strategic initiative. You can therefore understand why the war unfolds in the way it did, but the chapters collectively attempt to explain why Britain lost America. It was a war seemingly they should have won, with the most powerful navy in the world, with an army that was highly effective, in a country which was on the verge of becoming the first industrial nation in the world. The Navy was certainly the largest in the world, and this really gave Britain its power for the next 2 centuries and why it was able to become a global nation for a very small country. Britain in the 18th century aimed to have a 2-power navy. That was a navy large enough to combat both France and Spain combined. These were their traditional enemies. Its army, on the other hand, was much smaller than other European states, like, for example, Vienna and France. It was, though, a highly trained and highly capable army for its size. They did send their best generals and admirals to America. It's commonly thought that because of the patronage system that operated, the military leaders must have been incompetent and simply the next in succession. In fact, the government headed by George III and his Prime Minister Lord North skipped 105 more senior generals in order to choose Sir William Howe to command the army in America. Howe was chosen because he was an expert in light infantry, the very kind of tactics, much like modern-day commando groups, who would be effective, again, in a bush warfare, in what today we would call guerrilla warfare. They were aware they were going to encounter a different type of warfare from Europe. He seemed the man most experienced. They chose to go with him his brother, Lord Richard Howe, which may seem rather corrupt, but in actual fact Lord Richard Howe was a pioneer in amphibious warfare. That is, landing troops on the seashore. He helped design the kind of landing craft that was still being used at D-Day, where the bow of the ship would go forward like a gangplank. The two brothers got 16,000 men onto Staten Island within about 3 hours one afternoon. It was a highly effective combination. Similarly, the generals in succession to them, Sir Henry Clinton, John Burgoyne, Lord Cornwallis, were regarded as the cream of the British Army. Many of these people went on to successful military careers after the Revolutionary War. Lord Richard Howe became a hero of the French Revolutionary War after a battle he commanded called the Glorious 1st of June. Lord Cornwallis was successful in India as a general, commanding much larger armies than he commanded in America. Yes, the British really had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. It was an army that was able to take every American city at some point during the war. But whenever they tried to take territory, their position imploded. They lost territory in New Jersey in the winter of 1776-77. They lost it in Pennsylvania when Sir William Howe thought the taking of Philadelphia would lead to essentially the occupation of the central states of America. And they lost it very dramatically in South Carolina and North Carolina in 1780 and 1781. They also face logistical difficulties. These are often not popular to describe. They seem less interesting than battles, but no country had tried to fight a war 3,000 miles away against a hostile citizenry. So this was very different from the French and Indian War. It raised all kinds of problems. They expected they'd be able to feed their army from America within a few months, but they never gained enough territory. And so they had to send out a large part of the food supplies, candles, even forage for the horses. All of these had to be supplied from Britain and also from Ireland. This often led to delays. People ask why Sir William Howe didn't open his campaign earlier in 1777, or Henry Clinton in 1779. The reasons were they were waiting on their supplies. They needed at least several months' supplies before they could start a campaign. If the British Army ran out of food, it was much more serious than if it happened to the Continental Army. They couldn't simply go back to their farms and reappear another day, and the army could literally starve. And so generals had to wait and to delay campaigns for shipments to arrive from Britain. They were also dealing with a pre-modern administrative system. There were 5 different departments that administered the army. The cabinet, the government itself, was divided. The man who was in charge of the war in Britain, Lord George Germain, who was Secretary of State for America, didn't have any control over the Navy. So the British had what the modern day army would call a fractured system of command. There was no single commander-in-chief. They had separate commanders in America, in Canada, and in New York. There wasn't even a serving member of the cabinet who was Secretary of War. The Secretary of War did not sit in the day-to-day government meetings. The other major problem was that the Army and Navy were actually shrinking during the course of the war. So the British Army after 1778 was smaller than the army that had existed in 1776. In other words, they were trying to win the war with fewer men when they were fighting a war also with France, Spain, and later Holland. We tend to think of this as simply, and there's a tendency to really just think about the army. The Navy was crucially important. George Washington was one of the people on the American side who most and best understood that the Navy would be key to winning the Revolutionary War. He tried to have a coordinated offensive against the British with the French Navy in 1779 and 80. It failed because the French commander was more concerned about French interests in the Caribbean than in North America. The British commander at the time was Sir Henry Clinton. He also understood the importance of the Navy to the outcome of the Revolutionary War. His father had been governor of New York, and his father was an admiral. His uncle was an admiral. And Clinton had warned the British government that at any time that the British Navy was weaker at sea against the French, it would be possible for the Continental Army to surround and capture any contingent of the British Army serving outside New York. Indeed, he was concerned that the main British base in New York was vulnerable if the British did not maintain naval superiority. This is exactly what happened in Yorktown. And this was one of the reasons Clinton was so bitter after the war and wrote more about it than any commander on either side, because he had foreseen the possibility of Yorktown. He'd warned the government. He'd been told that the British would have a superior navy at sea, and he felt betrayed. It is. It's surprising, but the military commanders were much less hawkish than George III and his main war minister, Lord George Germain. Lord Cornwallis was one of only 6 members of the House of Lords who voted against the Stamp Act, the first tax of America, direct British tax from London. Sir William Howe told his constituents that he would never serve in America. Lord Cornwallis was loath to go to America, but felt it was a matter of military duty. And there were other officers who refused to go at all on grounds of conscience. It was indeed. They were acting on the information available to them. They were told primarily by American loyalists that the majority of Americans were indeed loyal to Britain. They expected that they wouldn't need a large army, that they would find the support in America. The error is also understandable given that even today you will find school textbooks which say 1/3 were loyal, 1/3 were patriot, and 1/3 neutral. One of the most current areas of research is on neutrality during the American Revolution, in which historians point out the majority of Americans didn't actually fight during the war. It's therefore understandable that the British got it wrong. They were hoping, even when they didn't have an immediate showing of support, that what today we would call the silent majority could be persuaded to support Britain. In fact, it was wrong. The British government collapsed before even a shot had been fired. The Patriots gained control, crucially of the militias, but also of the assemblies, the courthouses, and the majority of the newspapers. The British, when they left Boston in March of 1776, essentially had to start reconquering America. There were no British troops or British government servants left. It became very obvious when Cornwallis marched north through North Carolina that he couldn't even get the most basic military intelligence. The British Army started to describe it as an experiment, and the experiment was to find areas of strong loyalist support. And there were indeed some areas where loyalists were stronger than others, but never in the majority. Well, the war became global in 1778 when France entered the war with the largest navy after that of the British and a much larger army. But even before France formally engaged in the war, Britain had to think globally. It did not fully mobilize its army and navy in 1775 because they were worried if they did so that France would follow suit. The French were concerned that the British would get a huge army over to America, and once they put down the rebellion, that army would then go south to the Caribbean and take French sugar islands like Martinique and Guadeloupe. So the British began the war essentially with one arm tied behind their back. They had to be concerned about slave rebellions in the Caribbean when they moved or tried to move troops from Jamaica in 1776 to go to New York. There was an outbreak of a slave rebellion which might have been as successful as that of Saint-Domingue a couple of decades later, but for the fact it broke out prematurely. After 1778, their military was essentially over extended. The Navy had to provide convoys all over the world, as well as protect British possessions in India, in the Mediterranean with Gibraltar, Ireland and the Caribbean, as well as the west coast of Africa, and Britain itself. Britain was faced with the most serious attempts at invasion in the summers of 1778, 1779 and 1780, since the days of the Armada in 1588. It was a war that the British took very seriously. George III actually articulated the reasons for the war better really than anyone, and he increasingly argued that if Britain lost America, it would cease to be a major power. He regarded colonial wealth and trade as the keys to Britain's success. He believed really in a domino theory, that if Britain lost America, it would lose all of its other colonies as well, in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and in India. The British therefore pursued this war for 8 years, making it still the third longest in American history and one of the longest in British history. It was even being described by some of the extreme supporters of the government towards the end as a holy war. The argument of the book is essentially that the conditions of the war almost precluded a British victory. But historians never believe anything is inevitable. They're very aware of the role of chance and other contingencies that may change the outcome at any point in history. The war could have been lost by the Americans, and leadership plays a key role in their victory. It's very difficult to imagine anyone being as effective as Washington, and certainly not the alternatives who were considered during the war. John Hancock in Boston was seriously mooted in Massachusetts as an alternative commander-in-chief, and yet in many ways the man seems almost a poseur. He commanded during an operation in Newport very ineffectively. Horatio Gates was considered as a possible alternative to Washington after his great victory at Saratoga. But Gates himself was later defeated at Camden and infamously fled a couple of hundred miles from the battlefield immediately afterwards. Charles Lee was also considered as an alternative to Washington. But Lee had suggested really fighting a guerrilla warfare against the British. This typically would lead to anarchy. Washington was thinking as much of the country that would emerge after the war as merely defeating the British. He was very keen that America be considered a civilized nation in relation to Europe. He's sometimes been accused himself of being too conventional, but it was very important to him that they beat the British at their own game. Therefore, the great victories of the war were conventional type European battles, Saratoga and Yorktown, or even the Battle of Cowpens. These were the key turning points in which the tactics were very much those used by the British themselves. Indeed, it's remarkable to read British accounts at the end of the war in which they pay testimony to Washington and his army. They argue that they were as good as the British troops themselves, that they achieved a miracle by beginning as an unarmed citizenry and becoming so effective in such a relatively short amount of time. Interestingly, the British press criticised their own leaders and especially their own government, but they never criticised George Washington. He was admired in Britain. There is a statue of him today in Trafalgar Square next to Britain's greatest hero of all time, Admiral Lord Nelson. The British Navy fired a full gun salute and lowered their flags when they heard about Washington's death.